Okay, so now let's look at a contemporary utilitarian, Peter Singer. And he's probably the most famous person currently alive who promotes and defends utilitarianism. And he currently teaches at Princeton. So Singer argues, he very famously wrote a book called Animal Liberation, where he argues that animals deserve equal consideration. And so therefore they have a right, according to Singer, the right to equal consideration. But equal consideration doesn't mean that they should be treated equally. It just means that when we're thinking about pains and pleasures and suffering, an animal's suffering should be given equal consideration, as much consideration as it merits. Now, this means that in some cases, according to Singer, an animal's life will be more valuable than a human's life. Not in all cases, but in some cases. Now, just as we've seen a lot of work by Mill being done, Singer recognizes that human beings are capable of higher pleasures and higher pains, and so they are generally more valuable. When we consider a young, healthy human and an ape, the human being is more valuable. Even if it's not experiencing those higher pleasures, it's more valuable, as Mill argued, just because it could experience those pleasures. But if it's an elderly, senile person and a young, healthy ape, then the life of the ape is more valuable because its overall pleasures, because it's capable of higher kinds of pleasures. Now, according to Singer, if one denies this, then one is a speciesist. A speciesist is someone who thinks that the pleasure of their species are more valuable than the pleasures of any other species, simply because they are not members of the preferred species. Singer explicitly compares this to racism and sexism, hence the word speciesism. The racist gives special consideration to the suffering of people from their own race and discounts the suffering of people from other races. And the only reason that's given for this weighting of pleasures is that one belongs to a certain race. The sexist does the very same thing, but uses the category of sex as the weighting factor. So if you're a male sexist, you prefer or weight the importance of pains and pleasures in men over women, and if you're a female sexist, vice versa. In each case, Singer argues, what's going on is there is not equal consideration going on. There's preference or weighting, special treatment of one group, and the only thing that justifies this is membership in a group. Speciesists do the same for certain species, human species. So just because a person is human, just because a senile person is human, a member of a certain species, they're treated as more valuable. Their pains and pleasures are treated more valuable, worth more, when we're doing moral calculations, than the pains and pleasures of a healthy animal. Now, this doesn't mean that it's never okay to prefer a human over a non-human animal. Singer goes on to make sure we understand. In some cases, this is legitimate. So, and just like you're not a racist just because you treat races differently. If there is some reason to treat them differently, which isn't simply that they are members of a different race. So, for instance, doctors may treat African Americans differently because they are genetically more prone to certain kinds of diseases, like sickle cell anemia. So they might give them a test that they wouldn't give to someone who wasn't of that race. But of course, this different consideration, right? Maybe the test is painful, so they have to suffer through a test, and someone say that's racist. You only give the black people that painful test. Well, that's not racist because they're giving the black people that painful test because of their genetic predisposition to a certain kind of disease, say, for instance, sickle cell anemia. So you can treat races differently as long as the reason isn't based merely on the fact that they are of a different race than you. Now, also, you can treat sexes different as long as the reasoning is the same. So, for instance, some medical procedures may be necessitated in virtue of one's being a woman, which aren't necessitated in virtue, not just because one is a woman, but because of one's anatomy is different, because one has different sex organs, therefore one is liable to different kinds of examination, some of which may be more invasive, and so on and so on. So as long as you don't simply say you're a member of that group, therefore you're treated differently, then that's fine. You consider them equally. That may still lead to different treatment. Now, in the case of animals, considering them equally won't lead us, for instance, as Singer clearly points out, to giving pigs the right to vote. Considering animals equally doesn't mean they should be issued driver's licenses or that we are acting immorally towards them by not issuing them driver's permits. Rather, what it means is we should treat them in accordance to their nature. So giving equal consideration to a pig just means not torturing it to death, but rather letting it live in an environment which is conducive, or like its natural environment, something that it's conducive to pig flourishing. So in some cases we can say, look, there's a difference in treatment here. And so in some cases preferring human beings is a no-brainer because human beings are special and unique in the kinds of pleasures and pains they feel, but not in all cases. Not in all cases. So Singer's very clear that the line doesn't just follow the species line. Senile persons are more like pigs than they are like rational adult humans, and therefore aren't as valuable. So you can't say that they're valuable simply because they're humans. If what you're worried about is their pains and pleasures, then you need to consider everyone's pains and pleasures equally. Sometimes that the balance will tip in the favor of the human. Sometimes the balance will tip in favor of animals. Okay, so that sums up our survey of utilitarian theories. Now we'll turn quickly to some criticisms of utilitarian theories, in particular the criticism from Fairness by John Rawls. But before we turn to that, let's just briefly discuss some other criticisms. So utilitarianism is committed to the claim that every pain is equal insofar as it's the same kind of pain, whether it occurs in you, your wife, your child, your husband, or some stranger in a faraway country. So, in a fire, for instance, where you can save either your son or 10 strangers, utilitarianism seems to say you should save the 10 strangers. But that seems very strange to a lot of people. It seems as though the fact that this is your son should give you some special reason for saving the son. But the utilitarian says, no, it doesn't. The fact that it's your son doesn't matter. All that matters is which action produces overall the greatest amount of pleasure. Now, it also doesn't seem to be able to account for our sense of fairness or justice. So consider these two possible scenarios here. So suppose that in the first situation, there are 10 people and 8 of them enslave the remaining 2. This results in those 8 people being very happy and the other one being very unhappy, the other 2. Now, so let's sort of formalize this. Suppose there's 100 hedons there, and that the happy 8 have 90 hedons. That's 11.25 hedons each. Now, the other 2 split the remaining 10. That's 1 1/4 hedon. That's 1 1/4 hedon each. Now, the utilitarian, it seems again committed to saying this seems like a moral action. Happiness is overall maximized. Now, let's consider this other situation. Now, let's consider this other situation where everyone has an equal share of the 100 hedons. That's 10 hedons each. So in the first situation, we have some people who have over 10 each, right, 11. Some people who have very few. And in the second one, everyone has 10. Now, which of these is preferable? Well, the utilitarian seems to say, forced to say that the first one is better, right? There's more people with more hedons. So overall, happiness is maximized, even though the 2 people who are enslaved are not very happy about it. The second situation, the one that's fair, the one where the things are equally distributed, seems better. But the utilitarian doesn't seem to have any way to account for this. Now, Rawls argued that these kinds of scenarios show that utilitarianism of any kind can't capture our ordinary moral judgments about fairness. Therefore, there's something very wrong with utilitarianism, he thinks. So, as a way to see in more dramatic detail what's wrong with utilitarianism, he proposes what he calls the veil of ignorance. Now, a veil of ignorance is a hypothetical kind of situation. It's not something that really could happen. It's a thought experiment, something you're to imagine happening. So a veil is something that hides certain things from you. It's a curtain that shields you between, say, you draw over your eyes, right? So a veil of ignorance means that drawn over your eyes is being ignorant of certain kinds of facts. And in particular, it's facts about one's race, sex, ability, position in class, in society, etc., etc., etc. So behind the veil of ignorance, one does not know if one is a man or a woman. One does not know if one is Asian, white, black, Hispanic, or other. One does not know if one is great at baseball, a great debater, a great politician, or what? One doesn't know if one was born the son of a janitor, or the daughter of the King of France, or the trust fund baby of the Heineken dynasty. One does not know whether one is the upper class, middle class, lower class, working poor, Republican, Democrat. None of these facts are known. Now, what kind of rules would you accept if you were in this kind of position? Well, Rawls argues that you would only accept rules which were fair. So you wouldn't accept utilitarianism. You wouldn't accept the greatest happiness principle, because there would be no guarantee that you wouldn't be one of the slaves in that situation. And the greatest happiness principle licenses that situation. So you would reason as follows: would I allow people to be enslaved in order to produce the greatest amount of happiness? Well, gee, how do I know that I wouldn't be enslaved? Well, just to be safe, I better disallow rules of slavery. Now, suppose someone said, oh, but we'll only enslave the blacks. Yeah, but I don't know if I'm black, so I'm not going to endorse that rule. What if I vote for that rule and then I find out the veil of ignorance is lifted and I'm a black person? Now I just basically said that I could be enslaved so that everyone else could be happy. That's not something that's desirable. Suppose that someone said we should be allowed to kill an innocent person in order to avoid a riot. Well, what if I'm that innocent person? I'm not going to endorse that rule. So which rules would one accept? Well, Rawls produces two rules that he thinks people would accept behind the veil of ignorance. So we can perform this kind of thought experiment ourselves and see if we would endorse these rules, ignorant of our race, sex, ethnicity, position in society, etc. So the first one is kind of easy. Each person should get the maximum amount of goods or rights that is consistent with everyone getting the same amount. So basically everyone's equal. That's what the first rule says. No one's any better than anyone else, and everyone gets all the same rights, so no one gets any special rights or rights that anyone else doesn't have. Everyone's basically equal. And of course, you would endorse that rule because you don't know which group or you're in, so you want all groups to be treated equally. Here's the second rule, and this one's a little bit more counterintuitive, but the reasoning behind it is, once you see it, pretty straightforward. So in the case where inequalities are necessary, they can only be justified if they benefit the least advantaged member of society. So the first principle, and we'll come back to that, I'll tell you what that means in a second. So the first principle then, which people would endorse behind the veil of ignorance, Rawls thinks, dictates that every member of society get enough money to be comfortable no matter their work, right? So here's the basic argument that Rawls gives for why you would accept this. It's basically accidental whether one is born in poverty or in wealth. So it doesn't seem fair that some people would be doomed to a life of suffering simply because they were born into poverty, whereas other people are born into a life of high pleasure simply because they were born in appropriate circumstances. Now, so too, it doesn't seem fair that some people are born with certain skills. Those are accidents. Whether you're good at something or not, whether you have a certain ability or not, is an accident. It doesn't seem like those kinds of things should matter to whether one is treated in certain ways. So suppose that you were behind the veil of ignorance and someone said to you, look, those people who are less intelligent than other people, they're just going to do worse. If they can't think of a way to make money, then so much the worse for them. Well, what if you're one of those people? Right? Behind the veil of ignorance, one can see, well, these things are stripped away just so that we can see that our having them and being, whether you live a good life or not, doesn't seem like you would endorse that. So Rawls thinks that a truly just society is one where there is redistribution of wealth. So take, for instance, what happens in Sweden. In Sweden, they have very high taxes. So people who make money pay a lot in taxes. And that money is used to provide services for people who don't make a lot of money. So they have universal health care, for instance. So no matter what income you have, if you have cancer, you're going to get treatment. Whereas here in America, if you can't afford to get treatment, you will die from that cancer. And millions of people in the United States die because they can't afford to get medical care. Whereas in Sweden, nobody dies because they can't afford to get medical care. So too, if one needs a house, living conditions, one is provided for you, whether you can afford it or not. Now, this doesn't mean that one lives in lavish style, but one is provided low-income housing of a certain very base level kind, whether one can afford it or not. And again, this is all paid by taxing people who make a lot of money. So every person deserves or has a right to a good life, no matter the way where they were born, and the veil of ignorance is supposed to reveal to us. that that's the fact. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody should earn the same amount of money no matter how they work. And that, of course, is what was really objectionable, what people found objectionable in the early versions of communism, socialism, was the idea that, look, it doesn't matter if you're a doctor or a janitor, you make the same salary per year because everyone is equal, and janitors are no worse as persons than doctors. But, of course, the second principle says that, of justice, that Rawls proposed, says that there can be inequalities in our society as long as those inequalities are to the advantage of the least advantaged members of society. And what that shows is that you can arrange to treat people differently if it's to the advantage, the overall advantage of everyone, and especially the least advantaged members of society. So, for instance, suppose that you wanted to give an argument that doctors should make more money than janitors. What could that argument be? Well, going to school to become a medical doctor is very expensive, and it requires a lot of hard work. 10 years or so, not just the med school, the residency, the internship, all of that stuff has to be done before one can be a medical doctor. Now, how do you attract the very best and brightest members of a society to go into a field? Well, there's two things that you can do. You attach a high salary to the occupation, as well as social prestige. So when one says one is a neurosurgeon, people are impressed. When one says one is a janitor, people are less impressed. There's not as much prestige in society associated with certain jobs. One is a lawyer. There's a certain aura that goes around that one doesn't get from saying one manages a Burger King. One's a CEO of a company. People respect that more than they respect you telling someone you are a cashier at Jack in the Box. So those are inequalities. People treat you different. You're getting paid different salaries. And the Rawlsian argument says, look, these are justified as long as it's to the advantage of the least advantaged member of society. And in this case, it is. So think about, again, what's happening in Sweden. Doctors make a lot of money there. They're paid more money. Why? Well, because we want the best people being doctors. And having those kinds of very smart, dedicated, hardworking people in that field works out to the best of everyone. Since medicine is freely available to anyone who's sick, the average low income person who's just getting their base stipend from the government, which just gives them enough to get by, this person, when they go to the doctor for healthcare, they're getting treatment from the very best hardworking, dedicated, smart, intelligent people. So it's actually to their advantage that people are treated differently in this way. And there are all kinds of things like this that one can give this kind of argument for. That there are actually a lot of the inequalities that we have are actually beneficial to the least advantaged in our society, and so therefore acceptable to someone behind the veil of ignorance. So you're behind the veil of ignorance. You don't know if you're a doctor or not. You don't know if you're a homeless person or a doctor. But you can see whichever one of those you are. Suppose you were the homeless person. Well, it's better to have doctors paid more because you're going to be attracting a certain kind of person. And then if you're the homeless person, you're going to be getting this medical care free of charge anyway. So you want to make sure you have the best charge. Therefore, you would endorse this kind of inequality. Yes, they have more prestige. Yes, they can make more money. That's perfectly fair. It's fair because it actually works out to my advantage. The least advantaged person works out to their advantage. So Rawls is not saying, look, even though he is saying the people who make a lot of money should pay more taxes, and so therefore are sort of helping support people who don't make as much money. He's not saying that you shouldn't earn as much money as you can. It's just the more money you make, you have to pay these taxes, so you are giving up some of your money. But of course, that's because you see that from the veil, behind the veil of ignorance, that's what morality demands. Now, notice this is a very interesting view that Rawls has, because it mixes elements of all the stuff that we've been talking about. So he's got some bit of egoism in there, since what we're doing is, behind the veil of ignorance, really the only thing that are left that we're allowed is the fact that we're rational and the fact that we're self-interested, right? We're trying to think about what would be the best for me. How's it going to work out for me if this is the case, if that is the case, and I don't know these facts about myself? So you're trying to make sure you negotiate the best deal for yourself that you can. So it seems like it's got some egoism. It's got a bit of Kantianism in there, because you are sort of asking what would the world be like if various things were the case, or if they're universalizable or not. It's got a bit of utilitarianism in there, since you're asking about is this to the benefit or advantage of the least advantage. It's got a bit of social contract theory in there, because these things seem to be not like a state of nature, but the veil of ignorance is a kind of conceptual tool that allows us to approximate what it would be like in the state of nature, but in the respect that matters for Rawls. So it's a very interesting view that combines a lot of the elements that we have been talking about, and one could certainly use this in one's paper if it was appropriate. Okay, so that concludes these lectures. I hope that you enjoyed them. Please leave me some feedback. I'd be very curious and interested to know what you think.